Most eBay sellers never break past average. They list a few things, they get discouraged by slow sales, they start complaining about the algorithm, and eventually fade out. But a small percentage, well, they outperform everyone else, not because they work harder, but because they think differently. If you're doing any of the 7 things in this video, there's a pretty good chance you're above average, even if your numbers don't show it yet, so let's dig in. You want to know one of the clearest signs you're ahead of the pack as a seller? You've stopped complaining. Not entirely. Everybody vents now and then, myself included, but hopefully you've moved past the phase where complaining is your default setting. That puts you ahead of most. Because here's the truth. The average eBay seller is stuck in a feedback loop of frustration. Sales are slow, must be the algorithm. Sourcing is tough, well, blame the competition. Returns piling up, buyers are terrible. I get it. I used to do the exact same thing. It's easy to complain and weirdly comforting. You hop into a reseller group or a Reddit thread or YouTube comments, you toss in your complaint and people nod along, you feel validated, you feel seen, but the problem is you're still stuck. That dopamine hit feels like progress, but it's just a pressure release. Nothing actually changes. Nothing gets fixed. Above average sellers recognize that early. They feel the same exact friction that people who complain feel, but they use it differently. They investigate instead of vent. They analyze instead of assume. They adapt instead of spiral. When sales dip, they don't write off the whole platform. They go look at their titles, their photos, their categories. They check sell-through rates. They adjust their pricing. The important thing is they take action. And here's the key. Complaining replaces action. Once you cut the habit of blaming external stuff for every dip or delay, you get your power back. You stop waiting for eBay to be fair or for buyers to behave better or for thrift stores to magically restock just for you at rock bottom prices. You start building a business that can weather all of that because it's not reactive anymore, it's designed. So if you've caught yourself mid-complaint recently and instead asked, okay, what can I control here? That's rare, that's a skill, and that's a real edge that puts you above most other resellers out there. And that brings us to the second sign that you're an above average seller here. You define success on your own terms. Let's get into that next. Most sellers never take the time to define what success actually looks like for them. They just say vague stuff like, I want to make extra money, or I'm trying to grow my store, but they haven't decided what that really means or where they're actually headed. If you've moved past that, like if you've gotten specific about what you want and why, that puts you in a completely different category of sellers. Because average sellers, they just have a tendency to drift. They bounce from strategy to strategy. One week they're selling vintage clothing, next week they're doing video games, next week they're convinced that Amazon FBA is the real move, and then they eventually just burn out. Above average sellers don't fall for that cycle because they're not chasing someone else's idea of success. They've defined their own. When I finally got clear on my own definition of success, basically everything changed. I said, I want to generate $2,500 a month in net profit so I can take my family on a few extra vacations every year without touching our savings. That's it. That's the whole thing. That was my North Star. It's not flashy or anything, and I'm not going to build an empire with that goal, but it is real. And once you have that kind of clarity, your decision making gets way easier. You don't waste time comparing your results to some stranger on YouTube showing off their misleading 90-day total. You don't get tempted by every trendy side hustle. You end up just building the thing that you want. So if you've written down a specific number or tied your reselling to a concrete outcome like paying down debt or covering your mortgage or quitting a job, you're already above average here. You don't need to go full time to be taken seriously. You just need to be intentional. And here's the best part. This is entirely up to you. You can define success to mean whatever you want. And when you define success clearly, you can actually reach it because now you have a target. And without that, you're just sort of aiming randomly. Next, we're going to talk about how to track that progress because without data, even the clearest goals stay stuck in your head. Most eBay sellers are flying blind. They check their 90-day totals like it's a stock ticker and hope for the best, but they don't actually know how much they're making. Not really, anyway. Once you start tracking your numbers, you stop reacting emotionally and start acting strategically. The average seller says something like, sales feel sort of slow this week. Instead, you say, my margins dropped to 41%. Let's dig into why. And it doesn't have to be a fancy setup. You can use a notebook or a spreadsheet or a tool like Flipwise, which I built for this exact reason because I got got tired of guessing and hated doing a bunch of manual data entry. But here's what happens when you don't track your data. You end up overestimating your margins, or you assume you're profitable because you had a $300 day. But once you subtract shipping and fees and cost of goods and materials and returns, it might be half of that, sometimes less. One of the most common things I hear from new sellers using Flipwise is something like, wow, I'm making a lot less than I thought. And that realization kind of hurts, but it's also the start of real growth. Because once you know your numbers, you can start setting goals that actually move the needle. Instead of saying, I want to sell more, you say, this month I'm going to list 150 items with at least $4,000 in list value. Above average sellers don't just work harder, they work smarter because they can see what's working and cut what isn't. So if you're tracking your net profit, your margins, your average sale price, or how many listings you need per week to hit your income goal, then you've got leverage. And once you've got leverage, you're building momentum. You're not guessing anymore. But data doesn't mean much if you're constantly reinventing the wheel. So the next sign is that you've built real systems. So let's talk about that. Average sellers treat every listing like a brand new project. They move piles of inventory from one location to another. They can't find the tape. They forget which items were listed. Every step takes way too long. It's total chaos, and they think that's just how reselling works. But above average sellers, they systemized the chaos. They've built workflows to reduce friction. Everything from sourcing to photos to listing to storage to shipping. Each step has a place and a process and a rhythm. And it doesn't mean you have to have some huge operation with barcode scanners and fancy equipment and industrial shelving or that type of thing. It just means you're thoughtful. You've got a spot to take photos where lighting's already set up, so you don't have to take over your entire kitchen every time you want to list 5 shirts. You use SKUs and labels so that when something sells, you don't have to tear apart 5 bins looking for it. You've minimized the decision fatigue, and that's what systems do. When your workflow is tight, listing becomes a habit instead of a hurdle. Shipping takes like 15 minutes instead of an hour. And most importantly, when you don't feel like doing the work, your systems can carry you anyway. Systems mean you don't have to rely on motivation, because motivation is fickle and it comes and goes. With systems in place, it's easier to plug in and do the work even when you don't feel like it. So if you've put in the effort to simplify how you do things, even if it's not perfect, you're already way ahead. Because while other sellers are still getting organized, you're listing, shipping, and growing. All right, next let's talk about the mindset that makes all of that possible. Treating this like a real business, not just a hobby. Now here's where most sellers stall out. They say they want to grow, but they still treat eBay like a side hobby that they just sort of kinda do. Above average sellers make a different choice. They treat it like a real business, even if it's only part-time. And that shift changes a lot, because a hobby is something you do when you feel like it, while a business is something you build with purpose. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to register for an LLC or hire staff or make it your full-time job. It just means that you're operating with intention. You're building systems, you're tracking performance, you're reinvesting your profits, you're solving problems. You're showing up like this matters. I remember the first time that clicked for me. I had just spent hours trying to figure out how much I owed in taxes, and I had receipts literally in shoe boxes and numbers scribbled on sticky notes. It was a complete mess. That's when I realized, all right, this isn't just a side hustle. This is a business, and I need to treat it like one. So I got organized. I created simple processes. I invested in tools that saved me time instead of wasting hours on workarounds. Once you treat it like a business, you start making business decisions. What categories are actually worth my time? Where's my money going? What's dragging down my margins? And average sellers just end up guessing at those answers. Above average sellers analyze, adjust, and execute. So if you're doing the boring stuff like tracking expenses, managing time, building repeatable systems, you're not falling behind. You're laying the foundation that most sellers skip entirely. And once that foundation is in place, you can finally start making strategic decisions. And that brings us to the next sign. You don't just sell what you like, you sell what people want. Most sellers start out sourcing based on instincts. They pick up stuff they think is cool, or stuff that they'd buy, or stuff that feels valuable. And sometimes they get lucky, but luck doesn't scale. And above average sellers know that. They don't just chase what excites them, they chase what sells. They prioritize demand over personal taste. That means checking sell-through rates before every single purchase. That may mean passing on the cool item that only sells twice a year in favor of a boring one that sells every 3 days. That means understanding that market demand is the real boss here, not your gut. You can have the best photos, the perfect title, and the lowest price, but if nobody wants the item, it's just not going to move, or it's going to take forever. I see this mistake constantly. New sellers buying stuff that looks expensive, but a quick comp check would tell you that it's pretty much dead weight. You end up listing it and it sits, you get frustrated, you blame eBay, but the problem isn't eBay, the problem is the product. Above average sellers don't fall for that trap. They check comps, they filter by sold listings, they understand what's moving now, not what used to move 5 years ago. And they stay curious. They don't assume that they know everything. They look things up constantly, even stuff that seems worthless, because they know sourcing is a skill, and the only way to get better at it is to keep learning what sells and why. They don't get sentimental about inventory, they don't take it personally when something won't sell, they just pivot. So if you're out there checking comps on your phone, if you're studying new categories, if you're learning what buyers actually want, that's not a rookie move, that's a pro move. It is kind of boring, it's methodical, but it's exactly why you're selling more than most people around you. And if you're doing all of that and still here, still working, still learning, that leads us to the final sign. You didn't quit, and that matters more than anything. Most eBay sellers quit. Not in some dramatic way, they just stop showing up. Their listings slow down, sourcing dries up, they start blaming the platform, the buyers, the competition, until one day they realize they haven't sold anything in weeks, and then they just quietly disappear. If you're still here, still testing, still learning, still pushing forward, you've already outlasted most. Because reselling is not complicated, but it is relentless, and it requires a lot of work. There's always something to fix, there's something to learn, there's something that didn't go the way you thought it would. And most people don't have the stomach for that. They need immediate results, and when they don't get them, they just bail or move on to the next thing. But if you've made it through the slow weeks or the dud inventory or the what am I even doing moments, that says a lot. It means you've started to internalize what this actually is. A long game. It's not a quick flip, it's not a viral hustle, it's a commitment. And people who play the long game eventually win, not because they're smarter or luckier, but because they're still in the game when everyone else has tapped out. Being above average isn't about huge numbers or perfect metrics. It's about staying in the ring long enough to get better, to see patterns, to build systems, to compound small wins over time. So if you're still listing, still adapting, still trying to build something that works for you, that's it. That's the whole thing. You're already doing what most people won't, so hold on to that. Because while everyone else is chasing shortcuts or burning out, you're building something that lasts. And that's rare, and it's above average. All right, lights out. Well, you might be wondering why I'm not talking about what sold this week or my numbers for this week. It's because I was out of town. You might have noticed that my store was recently on vacation mode, so I didn't sell a whole lot. I did not allow sales while I was gone, and so I figured we wouldn't talk through my sales this week, but I still am here to do the lights out section. I know that all of y'all are just waiting for this moment where I turn the lights out and share what's on my mind. I'll tell you one thing that's on my mind is I was checking YouTube analytics, and I noticed that over 50% of the people watching this video right now, they're not subscribed to the channel, which, I don't really do the type of channel where I'm like, hey, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I don't know. I just usually don't do that. But here's what I'm trying to say. If you like the channel, go ahead and subscribe, because it helps my channel. It helps me continue to make videos, and I would appreciate it. So anyway, that's it. We'll see you next week.